I want everyone to do is just maybe take just a little bit of a deep breath. This afternoon is going to be waiting for you, and we'll just sit together and just talk about what peer support is and how it fits into the roles that are out there. So I'm very thankful that you guys would take time to sit and listen with me. So my perspective comes from both a lived experience and now the work that I do in the recovery field. And I want this time together to be, first of all, professional, but useful. And I want it to stay human, remembering that recovery is built on human relationships. I've always treated myself as a simple person. And when it really boils down to is just being able to connect with people that are in our care. And so today we're looking at the role of peer support within the recovery-oriented system of care. And I know you already understand what ROSC is very well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time defending the system or defining it. Instead, I'm just going to focus on what happens inside a healthy peer relationship that helps someone move forward and how that relationship strengthens the wider circle of care. So the question I hope we can hold throughout the session is, what can lived experience contribute to that is distinct, responsible, and connected to the rest of the recovery system? So my name is Mark Jago, and I am part of the SASC Peer Support Network, and we're a nonprofit community-based organization in Saskatchewan. And so how did I get started in peer support? And so at 27 years old, I guess that was my rock bottom. I was in a dark hole and I just couldn't find my way out. And one of the bravest things that I ever did was there was a man that I respected, and he happened to be walking by, and I was at my wit's end. I didn't know where to turn, and I just sort of blurted out, "Can I borrow a book from you?" I never told him what was going on or what was happening, but he recognized that I was asking for help. So the neat thing is that he said, I'll bring you a book on Saturday. And then he kind of stopped in his tracks and he came back and he said, "How about I go through that book with you?" And that sort of changed everything. He sat down with me, he got a few other guys around, and I realized that I wasn't alone, that I had to learn with life challenges in a different way because what I had been using wasn't working. It worked for a while until it didn't. I was insecure my whole life and I had trouble struggling with the pressures and the challenges that we've all faced. And I turned to alcohol, and that turned to anger. And then, at 27, I just kind of came to my end. So a mentor of mine, and I hate labels. I hate the word mentor, but he became a friend to me. But somebody took the time, they were consistent, and gave me the sense that I had value. And that line stays with me as someone treated me as though change was possible. I did not instantly change my life, but it did give me something that I could begin to borrow until I could find it for myself, and that was hope. I just didn't think that I was ever going to get out of the rut, and somebody saw the change before I could see it in myself. And so that was the first experience that I had with peer support. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years that led me here this morning or this afternoon, is just sharing how peer support has helped me, how I've seen it help others, and then how it helps in the bigger picture. As I just love how this whole idea of ROSC is just a team atmosphere, is that we're all working together for the betterment of the person that's in our care, and for us to take advantage of each other for the professional side and the peer support and everything in between. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I am interested. I wish we had more time that I could hear your stories. I'm all about stories, but I'd love for you to put in the chat just who you are, maybe where you're sitting today, what role you have, and then, what's one word that people need most in recovery? I came up with my own little list. People need hope first and foremost. I think the most dangerous place that a person could ever be in is when they don't have hope. Dangerous decisions are made and life becomes risky. So, people definitely need hope, safety, trust, belonging, choice, consistency, encouragement, and connection. So I'm just touching on what you guys already see out there. But notice that many of these things are not programs or job titles. They are experiences people have in relationships. Services definitely matter, and the quality of the relationship within and around those services also matter. So just being part of a service isn't necessarily going to drive the change, but it's the care that people receive in aspect of each service that is going to make the difference. And I'm going to return to these words later when we look at what healthy peer support actually offers. So this is the system that we're trying to build that is put the person in recovery at the center. You know, treatment and healthcare can contribute healing and stability. Counseling and coaching contribute to understanding and direction. Family and community can contribute to belonging and everyday support. And peer support contributes through shared experience. The person remains at the center with strengths, hopes, and choices, dignity, and changing needs over time. Good coordination means that supports communicate appropriately, understand the roles, and help the person remain connected rather than pulling them in different directions. Peer support is valuable because it contributes something distinctive. Our task is to help people build and use a wider network of relationships and resources while protecting their right to decide what recovery means in their own life. I, I think that I think that wisdom is not just the collection of knowledge, which a lot of people think that wisdom is, you know, this vast collection of knowledge. I think wisdom is more importantly, how do we use that knowledge and experiences? And so the whole recovery team works towards that goal. So we learn more about ourselves, we learn more about what has worked for others, and then we get to explore what is going to work for that person. So wisdom is taking knowledge and then actually living it out so that we can experience it. And I think that's what a lot of people are missing is that experiential side. They sort of see what life could look like, or they see a path to get there, but they don't know how to actually experience it. And so peer support is just a way of helping people practice new ways of living.
Mark, I just have a
Yeah,
quick question for you. So sorry to interrupt, but we
yeah,
saw your slides at the beginning and then your slides have disappeared. So I wasn't sure if you have,
okay,
yeah, because we saw them for a second and they were up,
okay,
but then they disappeared. So just wanted to let you
okay.
know.
Sorry about that. Let me figure out what I have to push here. So I'm going to hit share again. Are they back on there now?
It's just loading, but they are coming back up.
Okay.
Yeah, they're back up now. Perfect.
Oh, wonderful. For some
Thank you.
reason, the window is interfering with my notes. So let me just see if I can minimize that. Or if I can move it. There, I'll move it over there. Okay, so we're good to go there?
Yeah, we can see the slide. Thank you.
Okay, okay. So this slide talks about that understanding matters, you know, making sense of trauma, addiction, relationships, fear is a big one, grief, or patterns can reduce shame and open choices. So just understanding what is going on that drove us to the point where we were coping in maybe unhealthy ways. So we need to understand our past. And I don't want to create a false divide where clinicians provide insight and peers provide action. You know, every part of the system can contribute across the whole recovery process. So it all overlaps and works together. But, you know, we're trying to find that understanding. But there can come a point where another explanation of why I struggle does not by itself move me forward. A person may be able to describe their situation with remarkable insight, but still feel unsure how to live differently on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That's the tension. Recovery cannot remain only an explanation. At some point, what I understand has to understand my choices, my relationships, my habits, my boundaries and responses. It has to become lived. I talk a lot in my world about theory versus reality, you know, understanding versus, you know, going out and making different choices. And so I feel like 90% of gaining victory is being able to see the battle in the first place. You know, not just avoiding harmful choices, but beginning to choose the healthy options. You know, I lost a lot of years by just taking, for me, I took alcohol out of my life. I tried to take anger out of my life by just sort of being very passive, and I just felt completely empty. And so I feel a lot of times we focus so much on what not to do, but doing that just leaves us, you know, without purpose. And I felt like I didn't have any value. Like I'd worked so hard to get through a day, and I could, at the end of the day, I would go, okay, I didn't take that drink, or I didn't, you know, turn my house into a hurricane. Uh, but I really didn't do any good either, you know. So there's something about avoiding the unhealthy, but actually finding a way to live with purpose. And so I have actually found that the best byproduct of getting busy doing the good is that there's no time for the harmful. And part of peer support is encouraging people that is, you know what, we just got to get busy doing good things for ourselves and, you know, finding good relationships and spending our time wisely. And then we find that we don't have time for the bad. Because if you just focus on something and you go, okay, I'm not going to think about red. I'm not going to think about red, all you think about is red. You have no other choice. And so part of the whole transition in recovery and is finding the blue, you know, to be able to shift and to choose to do something different. So a person can know why they isolate and still isolate. They can understand why they reach for unhealthy options and still feel the pull to go down that old path. They can know what a healthy boundary is and still have no idea how to hold one when a relationship becomes difficult. You know, that does not mean that the person is unwilling or that insight has failed. Many old patterns once served a purpose until they didn't, right? I chose to start drinking because it helped me forget about life for a while and it worked until it didn't. And so those old patterns, you know, they served a purpose. And so they may have helped when someone survive or cope or avoid pain or create a sense of control. Recovery is not about shaming those responses, it's about increasing choice. You know, we can't beat ourselves up for not being able to choose something that we didn't know about in our path. We have to have grace to ourselves that had we known a different way to choose, we might have been able to choose. And, you know, for some of us, we just grabbed onto whatever we had learned from family or from situations that were around us. And now we're at a point where we're just trying to rebuild when those emotions or those hurts well up, we can recognize what we chose in the path and we start to choose something different. So the question gradually changes from why am I like this to how do I want to live now? And what might I try to do to challenge the old ways that show up again? Peer support can be especially useful in helping that question become practical and possible. Well, what do I do now? That's the biggest question I hear from people in recovery. They've done a lot of work to get to a certain point, and you know, what do I do now? So I think this is becoming a very important, and I'm working on this in my own mind, but there's that transition that goes on in people in recovery, you know, myself included. So the first question is what happened to me? This makes room for the experiences, circumstances, wounds, losses, pressures, and conditions that shaped a person's life. The second is how did I learn to deal with it? Here we recognize the coping patterns. You know, it might be substance use, isolation, anger, people pleasing, control, avoidance, or whatever helped the person survive or escape. We can understand the function without pretending the pattern is still serving them well. I think of these as the red choices. And it's interesting, I think that we're all wired the same. When life presents challenges to us, whatever those challenges might be, you know, there's different extremes, and sometimes people feel guilty that, you know, they reached for things that to help them that aren't as severe as other people. It doesn't matter, you know, when we have life's challenges, what have we reached to help with that? And so we start to understand these patterns and in how we learn to cope. And then the third question is how do I want to live now? We know how we don't want to live, right? That becomes aware. How do I, and so this turns attentions towards now, what do we value or what relationships actually build into our lives? What habits do we need to work on? You know, do we need to get rid of some habits and do we need to work some new habits into our life? You know, do we need to find some supports that are going to teach us these things? You know, we all need to be taught how to live. It's interesting. I think about like when little kids, I'm a fairly new grandpa and I've got a 2-year-old boy, you know, terrible twos. And nobody had to sit that boy down and tell him when he gets frustrated, you throw a temper tantrum. And this is how you throw a temper tantrum. You kick and you squeal and you have this outrage. Like nobody had to teach him that. But what we have to teach as parents and grandparents is when you get frustrated, there's a better way to deal with it. So we need to be taught how to handle life's challenges. And it starts when we're little and it goes right, I think, until the day that we die, is we're looking to be able to handle life's challenges better. You know, not perfect, but better. We start to learn about boundaries, identity, and choice. The power of choice is so powerful for us all, and especially those in recovery, that they can learn that they can choose a different way than they did in the past. I thought I was stuck in a rut, and I thought there was no way that I was ever going to be able to change until I learned that I can actually choose different ways of handling life. And then the person begins to name a future, not only just explain a past. And so that's that beautiful transition to what a new life is. And then the fourth part of the transition is what can I practice next? Recovery becomes real through actions, making the phone call, going to a meeting, asking for help, staying in a situation when you want to run, apologizing, uh, setting a new boundary, trying again, and then building that new relationship. And that's where I think of these as the blue choices. What can we do in those moments that are going to make us healthier? And the power to choose at the crossroad of temptation shifts something inside. Once we start to understand that whenever these emotions well up, I call that the crossroad of temptation, where we just have that moment. And that's why I don't like the word trigger. So I've in my own vocabulary, I've changed trigger to pressure. Instead of it being, this triggers me into a reaction, where a trigger is almost instantaneous, right? It seems like there's no control for us to slow down that reaction. Instead of it being a trigger, when we start to recognize pressures, right? When those pressures start to well up within us, that we're able to just take a pause for a moment and look back on how we've chosen in the past, and then start to go through that mental checklist of how can I choose differently, and then take that step of choosing differently, something healthy. So, to start thinking about life as not a series of triggers, but a series of pressures that can drive us towards good responses. And so that is something that peer support can help a person work through. So the progression, of course, is not a rigid set of stages. It is definitely not a linear, right? People circle back, they learn something new, it doesn't work, they struggle, they practice, and then they begin again. But it helps us to see that what movement can involve. It involves understanding, a little bit of hope of seeing somebody else has gone through the process and have come out on the other side. That whole idea of practice. I'm all about practice. Learning something new takes practice. I've said for a long time that I'd like to learn how to juggle, and I can't juggle because I haven't practiced. And just like playing guitar, if I would spend 10 minutes a day practicing to play the guitar, a year from now, I would be better at playing guitar. And the same mentality has to go into our recovery and our new habits that we're building. It does take practice. And a lot of times we see where we want to be, and we're frustrated that we're not there instantly. We want that switch to go off and the change to happen. A lot of times it does come through that practice. And then through that practice, we see that live changed. At that moment of temptation, we now have something different to reference. I might have gone to the red 1,000 times, but I've gone to the blue 100 times, and the blue has been better, most of those times. So we start to get a new way to shift into healthy ways. So peer support can occupy the space between I understand myself and I'm learning to live differently. The peer support does not own the progression. The peer helps make that next step believable and less lonely. And they also celebrate the small victories that build change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about celebrating those small victories in a little bit. But I think that is key in whatever role that you happen to be in, is to celebrate those little victories, because they just build off each other. So lived experience can do more than help someone feel understood. At its best, it offers living evidence that a different life can actually be lived. It's nice to sit across the table from somebody and see something similar in that person's past, and the reality that that person was able to change. People need to see that. And the peer is not saying, here is what you should do, or, my path has got to be your path. The message is closer to, I recognize something about your story. Here's what it looked like when I began moving forward. Can I walk beside you while you discover what your path looks like? It's giving people that freedom that, what, they don't have to do a checklist to get to a certain point. We just share our lives with each other and be open that this worked for me or this helped me, but it might not work for you, but it might be worth exploring. And that gives people that opportunity to choose for themselves what they want to try next, and to encourage them. To tell honestly, it was scary. Change is the scariest thing that we can ever go through. And people need to hear it's okay to be scared. We're gonna move forward in spite of that fear. So there's three contributions inside that message is recognition. Recognition softens isolation. It's nice to know that we're not alone. I thought that I thought I was broken and that I was unique and I shouldn't be living this way. And I learned, you know what? We're all wired that way. We all have to learn these things. And so just recognition, just makes people feel less alone. And then evidence makes people more credible when you can see somebody that's changing right in front of your eyes. One of my favorite quotes is reading about a country does not mean that you've been there. And I think a lot of people are living in that world right now. So if I was to go to Italy, I could read all about Italy but that doesn't mean that I've been to Italy. I might be able to quote that book, sorry, and talk about different restaurants and different things, but it's different if I could sit down and talk to somebody that's actually been to Italy. There's something different about that. And so, it's where that theory versus reality starts to take over. And companionship makes experimentation less lonely. Recovery can feel very lonely, but it is a choice to be alone. And people sometimes don't like to be told that it's a choice. We tend to want to isolate ourselves away from a problem. It's nice to know that, hey, you don't have to be alone. You're choosing to be alone. And then to be able to talk about how does being alone help and how does being around people that are going to encourage you and support you and encourage you, how is that going to be better than trying to do it alone? I went through life on my own and I made quite a mess of it. And so I do need help. And so people need to know that it's perfectly normal and to need help because we all know what living on our own tends to do. So a shared experience says you may not be the only one. It can reduce shame and create a quicker sense of recognition. Hope says movement is possible. It becomes more believable when connected to a real person in real life. Belonging says there is room for you here. Recovery is difficult to sustain when a person feels they must do it alone. Recovery is awfully tough to start. That first step of reaching out for help, but it's even tougher to sustain when all the professional help is in the background. It's one thing to get recovery moving. It's tougher to keep it moving. And so peer support fills in that aftercare model is what do I do when I leave treatment to continue with the work that has started. And encouragement says that your effort matters, including the small effort. A peer may not notice courage that a person has yet to learn to recognize. That happens quite often when we tell people that was a very courageous thing that you did, whether they set up a new boundary or, they went into an office to apply for housing or they went into a counseling office for the very first time to make an appointment. Like that takes a lot of courage and people need to hear that. And so they don't realize that that was a courageous act. And then that starts to breathe new life into them. And accountability says your choices matter and we can look honestly at what happened. Healthy accountability is not surveillance, control, or shame. It's a respectful invitation to notice, to maybe adjust, repair, reconnect, and then try again. Accountability helps talk through reasons versus excuses for not following through on the plan. So that's something that we run into a lot of times is reasons versus excuses. So somebody has, you're in an accountability meeting or it's part of the accountability, and the week before a person says, I had planned to go in and apply for my housing. And so there's kind of that question that comes up. Hey, Bill, how did you make out with your housing application you talked about last week? And he goes, well, I didn't have a chance to get it done. And so to not just leave it there, why didn't you get it done? Well, I had a very good reason for it. I was playing video games 20 hours a day. Well, that sounds more like an excuse than a reason. Now, if Bill had said that he was in the hospital for 6 days, that definitely is a reason. But it's nice to talk with people about if they plan to take the next step, whatever that might be for them, and they don't accomplish it, to be able to talk through the reasons versus excuses. And if they hadn't done what they said, and it is an excuse, to encourage them then to let's get back at it and try again. So helping people understand the difference between a reason and an excuse. So together, these experiences help a person remain engaged with recovery relationships and services. They do not remove the responsibility, they make responsible action more possible. So similarity can create trust, but it never gives me the right to assume I know exactly what the other person feels or needs. Two people can have experiences that sound similar and give them both a different meaning. My lived experience should be a bridge into curiosity, not a verdict about someone else's life. So I can say some part of that sounds familiar to me. Would it be helpful to hear what I learned? That leaves room for consent and for choice. So disclosure should also be selective and purposeful. I do not simply share because a story is true or because telling it helps me. I ask whether it is safe, whether it is relevant, boundaried, and more importantly, likely to benefit the person listening. A lot of times with lived experience, there's that risk to just want to talk about ourselves and how much we've been able to move in our life and all these sorts of situations because we're quite proud of where we were and where we've ended up, but our stories has to be shared only if they're going to benefit the person that we're talking to. How can my life be a benefit to this person's life? And that becomes tricky. So recovery becomes in real ordinary moments. So I wanted to just talk about one story that has affected me so much in recovery work. And we're in a peer support meeting and we're talking about, next steps. We're basically trying to set ourselves up for a little bit of an accountability for the next week. And around the room we went, what is something that we want to do this week? Something simple. Peer support is setting people up for measurable victories. And so people are going around the room and they're just sharing what they want to do. And there was one guy that had joined our group. He'd been part of our group for a long time. And he was always really quite quiet. And lately, life is starting to be breathed into him. And for one of the first times ever that he really spoke up, he sat up pin straight and he says, next week my house is going to be spotless. He had mentioned in earlier meetings that he had sort of let his house get away from him. He had lost a daughter tragically 16 years ago, and his marriage didn't survive, and so life just slowly started to get away on him. And during this meeting, he was getting excited about everybody else's stories, and he wanted his house to be clean again. And we could have, or I could have, I was facilitating that meeting. I could have said, that sounds great, do it, knowing full well that like his house was in rough shape. We'd be setting him up to not succeed. And so I just simply said, why don't we just to pick one room and start there? And what room would you like to start? And he said, I'll pick the dining room because I think now it's becoming real. Once it's out, it's out, and now it's becoming real. So we picked the dining room because that was probably the easiest. And so I just simply said, how is your dining room? And he goes, now he's starting to deflate a little bit. And he goes, oh man, like I can't do it. And I said, that's okay. How is your table? And he goes, I haven't cleaned off my table in probably 3 or 4 years. I said, do you think you could do your table this week? And he says, yeah, I think I could. And it took him it probably took him about 5 days, but he sent a picture to the group text. Table was cleared off. He actually put a brand new plant on the table and the sun was coming through the window and it was just like a movie moment. And we celebrated with that man like he won a gold medal. Nobody said there's no condemnation, like, what are you doing? Like, how did you let your house get that bad? Or, big deal, you cleaned your table. Like, there was absolutely none of that because we knew for him that that was huge. And so we celebrated. And as we're celebrating with him, like everybody wanted their dining room table story. Like, what is my table? What can I do? And I think that's a kind of a picture of what happens to people in recovery, that one day they sort of wake up and realize that my life has kind of gotten away from me to a certain degree. And just like that man could picture his house clean again, we all kind of see how our life is going to be, cleaned up and to the point of, before we had let it get away on us. But there has to be there's the steps that go in between that of how do we get to that clean house to what we see around us. And the reason why I say that is because that man's house is now clean. It took him over 6 months, but it all started with that dining room table. He's cleaned out his garage. That was this summer's task. He actually painted his fence. He's got physical problems with his shoulders, and he could only do 8 feet a day. But he would come to the meetings and say, you know what, I got another 8 feet done. And by the end of the summer, he had had his whole fence painted. And what's exciting about this man's story that started with that table is he realized that his son had also lost a father. So his son not only lost a sister in that accident, but his father disengaged completely. And he reconnected with his son and he's reconnected with his sister. And so just to remind people of recovery just is built upon the little things. And because that man found himself in a room where that was encouraged and supported, he has just absolutely flourished. And so, if you hear anything today, maybe in the back of your mind, what is a dining room table in your own life that maybe you have put off for a little while that you can tackle and that can be the start of something. And so we need these little victories in our life to remind us of how much growth is possible. I also want to talk a story. And so this is about, transfer of care and how, different aspects or different care members can work towards each other. We had a lady that came to a peer support meeting and she was, in her late 60s, mid 60s, somewheres in there. And for the first 3 meetings, she never said a word. She never said boo. And then finally, she was able just to open up and she says, "This is my story." She says, I'd been going to the ER multiple times a month. I think she was going like upwards of 3 times a week into the ER for anxiety and panic attacks. And it turns out what was going on is that her medication had changed. She'd been on the same medication for decades and it wasn't doing what it used to do. And so they had changed her medications and she was dealing with the side effects and all the things that go with transition from new medicine. And she was panicking about that and she's going to the ER. So what her ER doctor did one time, she got an ER doctor that knew about our peer support group, and he just simply suggested that why don't you go sit in and just see if you can maybe find some support in between ER visits. A lot of times we can't help you here with what's going on in your life. And so as she's talking and she finishes her part, lo and behold, there was another person that was sitting next to her that said, "You know what? Me too. I went through a medication change 5 years ago and I experienced almost the same thing that you're talking about." And then she went on to say, "I just want to tell you that it does take time for the new medication to take over. The side effects do change, and my doctor had to work a few different times with changing prescriptions to just sort of get things right. But I just want you to know that it does get better." And the lady you could just see the stress and the tension just release from her shoulders because she had heard firsthand from another person that went through it. Her doctor had told her that very same thing. Her family probably did, other people have, but when she actually sat down with another person, she was able to relate to that and she found the strength. So no role was diminished in this story. The physician did not try to become the peer group did not try to become the medical care. The strength was in recognizing a need, knowing a trustworthy resource, and then making the bridge between them. And likewise, peer support can suggest care outside of the group that might be worth exploring, a smooth transfer of care for the person in their journey. So peer support is not just for professionals to send people into peer support. Peer support can also then transfer care into the professional side to be able to say to somebody after a meeting, you might just need more help than this group can supply. And, would you be interested in talking about a few different options that are available for where we live? And so that transfer of care, so it just flows in and back and forth. So an important test of the healthy peer support is, does the relationship help the person recognize, access, and remain connected to a broader network? Peer support should become a doorway to a greater connection, not a doorway that closes behind someone. So peer support is just that humility that the peer support doesn't think that they're going to provide all the answers, but they want to make sure that people are aware of help that's out there and just to be able to engage with them and to hold into that engagement over a longer period of time. So, as we care responsibly for people, I'm learning that boundaries are so important. Boundaries are not a withdrawal of care. They are one way we care responsibly. Clear rules make relationships safer, more trustworthy, and more sustainable. And autonomy means that we use open-ended questions, we offer options, and respect the person's right to decide. We do not want to use our recovery story as authority over someone else's choices. Dignity means that we see the whole person, including the strengths and the hopes. We need to remind people of the good that they have within them and how they improve our lives, not only just the risk or the difficulty that they're going through. And scope matters. Like part of peer support training is I spend more time training people on what peer support isn't than what it is, right? So peer support is not therapy, it's not medical treatment, crisis intervention, case management, or directing a person's life. A peer should know how to respond when safety concerns arise and how to involve appropriate crisis or clinical resources and how to document or consult according to the organization's policies. Transfer of care when needed. So to be able to stay in your lane and to be willing to say that this is more than my abilities or more than my role, I need to find the help. And so finally, no peer support should become a person's entire system. Supervision, team communication, referral pathways, workload limits, confidentiality practices, and the peer's own wellness are not administrative extras. They are conditions that make good peer support possible over time. And clear boundaries are the key to maintaining long-term goal. It is so easy to get burnt out in the work that we do because we take so much responsibility for that person's entire window of care. And so we need to be able to make our boundaries clear. I tell people like in that are going to be a facilitator that they're not a traditional sponsor or they're not a crisis worker. They're not going to be available at 3 o'clock in the morning. But to be able to tell people, hey, if you are in crisis at 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone number isn't the one to call. This is the one to call. And that keeps everybody sort of in their lane and that we're not doing this alone, that we have a team for that person to help take care of them. So no, so just some things, what can we start to maybe add to what we're already doing or just to keep doing, these sorts of things is integration begins when knowing the real options in the community, not only the program names, but who they serve, how to access them, what barriers exist, and whether the connection is likely to feel safe and welcoming. A 5-minute phone call to a group facilitator will allow you to refer with confidence to what that person in your care will experience. So 2 of those calls a week for a month will put 8 more tools in your kit. So for the people in your care, if you just call up the different peer support groups in your area, instead of just giving them a link to a website, if you just make that 5-minute call, hey, facilitator, like where does your group meet? And what if I were to recommend somebody coming to your group, what could they expect? What format are you using? What kind of pressures are in there to share and all these kind of things so that you can with confidence, refer that person to something that you have a little bit more knowledge in to just what you think it might be or what you heard from others or what it might be, just give that quick phone call. And if we just made, like I said, 2 of those calls a week, all of a sudden you've got a whole whack of people and peer supports in your toolkit that you can use because there's no one format that's going to work for everybody. And that's why in the work that I do, when I find all the different peer support groups that are out there, I want to know what they all are. Just like why is there so many different restaurants in a town? Because there's different tastes for different people. We want to be able to give people choices and say, what do you think is going to be the best fit for you? So, and then a useful question to ask your person in care is what kind of help would be useful right now? And what would make it easier to connect with it? That question helps keep the person's choice at the center while also helping to notice practical barriers such as transportation, cost, timing, fear, which is a big one, just to be able to say like what's an objection that we can overcome to get you into a peer support. And a lot of times that's fear. I don't know what to expect. The hardest thing for a person to do is go into that room the very first time. And then to be able to talk about past experiences. Maybe people have had a bad past experience in peer support. And just to let them know that that doesn't mean that the next one is going to be similar. It might be, but it might not be. Just to be willing to encourage that exploration. I talk about peer support groups as let's just go on a date with this peer support. We're not going to the altar. Let's just see what this peer support group has to offer and just see where it goes. And if it doesn't work, we can go on a date with a different one. So there's not this lifelong commitment to a peer support group. Let's just see if it's going to benefit us. Right. And then accessibility or uncertainty about what will happen next. So just to have that conversation with the person that's in your care. And organizations can support this work through clear referral, pathways, warm handoffs, peer participation, in team planning, role clarity, supervision, and feedback from the people receiving support. So as you work within your organization, it's just to have these conversations in your meetings. Hey, I had a talk with Bill, who runs this group over for Emotions Anonymous or whatever that group happens to be, and this is what they're all about. And I think it might be worth recommending people to something like this. So as we share resources with each other, then we're not alone. So I invite people to think about one support in your setting that people may need help recognizing, accessing, or reconnecting with. What is something that you know of that's going to be a benefit to the people in your care, and maybe for your coworkers or the people that are helping you support others. And then I'm going to close with this. I think I'm getting close to my 45 minutes. And so this is what I've based my whole life on, is that my flame may not be the biggest or the brightest, but it is real, and someone else might be able to light their candle from it. So a recovery story or our lives don't have to be finished or perfect or impressive before it can help. The purpose of our story must serve the listener. It must be real and it must be genuine. Motive is everything, and the person in our care can tell. So, people will forget. And you listening here today will probably forget 80% or maybe more of what I've talked about. But there's going to be that feeling or that motive of what I'm trying to get across. And that's what I rely on, because I am a very simple and unpolished person. I want the motive to come across is that we're just willing to share our lives with another person, and that makes a difference in that person. And people can tell when we're real. A lot of times I overthink things and feel like I have to be polished or expect to have all the answers. I even overthought this presentation. I've never used slides before and all this kind of stuff. But at the heart of it all is that people can smell our motive. We can tell when people are being fake with us. When we're being fake with somebody and they call us out on it, it drives us crazy. Or, oh, you know what I mean? Don't you hear my words? But it's the motive behind the words that matter. And that's what I want to encourage everybody listening today is, at the end of the day, the care that you're giving people, if it comes from the right motive, it's going to make the difference. And oftentimes it's the little things that make the difference. And time is our biggest enemy. Like our workloads with people are overloaded, and we have very limited time to spend with people in our care. But what do we do with that time? If that person, you even being honest, with that person and saying, what, I'm just overloaded today and I've got a lot on the go, but I'm trying really hard just to be here with you, and I want to hear your story, and I want to share my life with you, and I want to be a help to you. When you say that from a genuine heart, people will be able to hear that, and it makes a bigger difference, to let your weaknesses out. And I think that everyone on this call today has probably had somebody in their life that has made a difference. Somebody that got, and I think that's why we get into this line of work, is because somebody gave us a little bit of hope, a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of accountability, and that made a difference in our life. And we want others to experience that. That's why I got into this work. I realized that change was possible. I seen other people that were hurting, and I just wanted to do my small part, knowing that there's a whole army of people out there with that same motive and that same heart. And that's what we're doing in this recovery orientated systems of care, is we're just gathering everybody together with different expertise and different stories and different strengths, and putting them all together to help the people that are in care. And I often say that if somebody is in need of care in our country, like, what better place in the entire world to be than in Canada or where we are, because our greatest resources are people, and there are efforts being made to make help more available, to normalize needing care, and on all those sorts of things. And so I just want to remind everybody that your words matter, but your motive matters just as much. People are going to leave your space and go, that person really cared about me. And they won't remember exactly what you said, but they'll remember your heart. And so recovery happens through many relationships, and peer support makes a distinctive contribution when it helps people stay connected. We tell people, make sure that you are taking advantage of the other team members, whether that's a counselor or a treatment center or, all the team members, stay connected, stay engaged, take advantage of being able to to be able to sit with the different professionals, right? If you have to be there, you might as well invest in it. You have nothing more to lose. Same thing when you're sitting in a peer support meeting. If you're going to be there for an hour, why not engage in it and see if you might get something out of it, that maybe stage. And then that they translate that into an understanding, into a life that they can begin to live. And so with that, that ends my presentation. So I want to remind everybody of how important everybody's role is, that you're part of a bigger team. And and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. And what does someone's recovery story need to become before it's ready to help other people rather than just their own?
Mm. I think their recovery story just has to be real. It doesn't have to be polished or perfected. It just has to be genuine. We're storytellers by nature, and just to be able to be able to want to be willing to share your story with another person is a great gift, but also to be able to receive somebody's story is a great gift. And so, no matter what role that you're in, professional or peer support, or even just being a good friend, a good parent or a grandparent, being willing to be brave enough to share life's challenges and how you maybe handled them, to not have to put yourself on a pedestal, to say, you know what, when I was struggling, I reached for these red choices, and I'm not perfect by any shape of the means. I'm trying to learn how to live life better. And so, just being willing to be open to take that risk to share your life with others is all that it takes, and then just see where it goes.
Thank you. And you did touch on this with your story about the person who was kind of going into the emergency room and sitting down at a peer support and kind of explaining her story and hearing someone else who had a similar story. So that kind of falls into my question of what happens with someone in the moment they hear a story that kind of sounds like their own.
Mm. There's that deep breath of, oh, me too, right? And to be able to be connected with somebody so that you don't feel like you are broken beyond repair, that it is perfectly normal and actually perfectly natural to have these challenges and the different ways of handling them, and to know that. And what's interesting is that of all the red choices out there, the core reason for choosing them is that when life presents a challenge, whatever that might be, it could be trauma, or we all know what that is. um, but the reason that we are reaching for the red choices is we're looking for an escape from the challenges or from the hurts, or we want to forget for a while. So even though I may choose alcohol, somebody may choose gambling or porn, or doom scrolling is a big one, or gaming. It's all for the same reason. When life gets hard, we need a break from that. And these red choices, they give us that break, but it doesn't make our life any better. It just distracts. Where to be able to go back to the core reason of why are we reaching, or why are we needing the escape for the first place, and then in that moment to be able to find a different way. So it's powerful in a peer support room when somebody is brave enough to tell their story and they say, I reach for this. There's usually somebody else in the room that goes, you know what, I reach for the same thing. My circumstances aren't exactly the same, but I reach for the same thing. And then somebody else says, you know what, I reach for something a little bit different, but the same thing. I'm just looking for a break from life. And then to have that other person that come in and say, you know what, I was reaching for these things too, and I found a new way to live. And I think you can too. Oh, that just breathes hope to get people into that maybe stage. And so one of the roles of peer support is to get people to that point where they say, this is how I've handled life in the past. And then that's the building block. Okay, so when this wells up, how then are we going to choose differently? And like I said, I lost almost a decade for just avoiding the bad. And that's not a life anybody wants to live. It's just empty, and it's lonely. And so we need those blue. We need to know what to do in those moments. And so that's what happens in peer support.
Thank you. We do have a question from Sandy. How would you define the difference between peer support and recovery coaching?
Mm. That's a great question, because I think they're closely connected. So recovery coaching is typically one-on-one is what recovery coaching is. But a recovery coach is basically doing the same thing as a peer support facilitator, is just to be able to talk through life, to help encourage, different choices in their recovery journey. Peer support is typically more in a group setting, but it doesn't have to be. So there's one-on-one peer support, which is virtually identical to one-on-one recovery coaching. But the idea is that both peer support and recovery coaching want to keep people engaged in their recovery journey, whatever that might look like. So the next step, the celebrating the victories, the accountability. So very closely connected. And I just think recovery coaching is, like I said, more that one-on-one role. I'm a little bit of a purist, and it's changing as I get more involved with this. But to me, peer support was always in-person group setting. And I'm realizing that, there's online groups, and there's also one-on-one peer support. So I'm changing my view a little bit, but in my mind, peer support has always been that group setting compared to recovery coaching. Great question.
Then we also have this might be a question. So it can be hard when making a connection with participants. At one point, does coaching shift into dependency, and how do you intervene with clear boundaries?
Well, I can touch on that one as other people are thinking about examples, but those clear boundaries are just so key. It's almost like that working agreement that you have with your person in care, on what role that you are going to be, just to make sure that they know that I don't want to be your only support. I want to make sure that this is the role that I have in your life, and this is how I'm going to be able to help you in your journey, so that people know. And then that way, when those boundaries start to cross over, then you're able to go back to that working agreement, or just that reminder, this is my role in your recovery care team. And that helps make it so that you're not the bad guy when you have to bring up, when boundaries are crossed. You're just reminding people of the boundaries that you have set, and also to talk about their boundaries too, because it's a two-way street. So boundaries are important so that maybe what's off limit with the person that's in your care. And if you accidentally cross boundaries, that they also have the freedom to say, hey, I just want to remind you've just crossed a boundary that we had talked about earlier, and to have that mutual respect. And it's nice when it goes both ways.
Okay, thank you. All right. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and experience with everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And I know everybody definitely got a lot out of this session. I also want to thank everybody else who joined us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. And thank you all for patience as I stumbled and mumbled. This was my first time ever doing this. And so, yeah, hopefully everyone got a little something out of it, and that we're refreshed. We had a little bit of a deep breath. And as we go into our afternoons, we can just remember just how important our words are, and more importantly, how our motives are and how that's going to come across. And so we just all have a wonderful opportunity to make someone's life just a little bit better today. And what a gift and an opportunity that is. So thank